In what world is there any appropriate context to be talking about a bloodbath in the wake of January 6th?
It's a great question, a great subject, a great debate, and how really pathetic it is that we're in the middle of this right now. It's not what you say that matters. It's what people hear. And the fact is, there are millions of voters across the country that heard the word and thought, what exactly does he mean? I trust him at his word that he meant it about the auto industry, but the very fact that people were confused tells you the situation that we're in right now, both that he uses language that is over-caffeinated and can be misinterpreted, and that we're also extremely sensitive right now to everything that people utter. And at a time like this, it's even more important than ever that we be careful about the language that we use. Even in this interview, I'm speaking a little bit more slowly because I'm trying to measure my words to make sure I articulate this exactly as I mean. That has not been a trait of Donald Trump, not just over the last 3 years, but over the last 8 years. I do think he was misinterpreted, but the fact that he allows himself to be in that situation is something that he should pay attention to, and we all know that he doesn't.
Well, you say he's misinterpreted, Frank, and it depends on how the person receiving his comments interprets it. But isn't it true that a large portion of America has already decided what way they feel about former President Trump as an individual, and therefore how they are likely to interpret things that he says? For his supporters, this likely was more evidence that the media is working against him, trying to spin his comments into something that he did not intend. On the other side, it's a sign that he's a danger to democracy. And I just wonder how big the group is of individuals who are likely to be more considerate of what it is he's saying, trying to decipher it and make up an opinion.
It's very small. It represents perhaps 5% of the population. Even when people say they're undecided, it's not true. So right now, if you give all the different options that you can vote for Bobby Kennedy, that you can vote for a new no labels candidate, a different independent candidate, or some of these smaller parties, even when you do that, the percentage of undecided is 5%. But the truth is, it may even be smaller because they may not have decided who they're going to vote for, but they have definitely decided who they're going to vote against. And let's say that that is 4%. There are only 8 states that are in play right now, so it's 4% of the vote times the 8 states, and that represents literally 1% of America who's going to determine the next president of the United States. When it is that small a group, surely you should be more careful with your language. Surely you should say things that aren't necessarily meant to inflame. They can still agitate. They can still be direct and honest and crystal clear. But to use a word like bloodbath, it's not necessary. And yet this is part of his campaign. And it's what those who would like to vote for him because they agree with his policies, it's what's giving them hesitation because they don't agree with his persona. And I want to emphasize that. There is a segment of America that would absolutely vote for Donald Trump because they think he was a better president than Joe Biden, but they won't vote for him because they are afraid or insulted by how he carries himself.
You know, we saw a fascinating number, Frank, in an Emerson poll. Emerson polling came out looking at Ohio. 8% of Trump voters there said they would actually vote for Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, their own senator here, and maybe there's some personal feeling about it. But we talked as well about coattails and something that we might consider reverse coattails in this case. Spencer Kimball from Emerson Polling talked about the way passion is working almost in an upside down fashion on the ballot. Here's what he said.
What's interesting is that while Biden might lack enthusiasm on the top of the ticket, these other Democratic candidates, like Sherrod Brown, as you mentioned, has more enthusiasm. So it's almost as if these down ballots might be able to carry Biden over the finish line in some of these states.
Is that a phenomenon that you're seeing, Frank?
Yes, but it plays differently in each state. So a state like Montana, West Virginia, Trump's overwhelming popularity is going to help the candidates beneath him. And there are 2 important Senate races. And so often people forget that who controls the Senate determines who controls the hiring. the approval process, the vetting process for Supreme Court, for the administration, for the ambassadors, and that in some states that benefits the Republicans. In other states where Trump is not as popular, you're going to have Republicans trying to run ahead of him and maybe running separate from him. But that still doesn't change the fact that the intensity, as you correctly note, is so strong on both sides that there were very, very few people who are undecided. And a simple misuse of a word or phrase could determine the election outcome.
Frank, just quickly, we only have a minute left with you, but in Ohio in particular, as we're talking about a vulnerable incumbent in Sherrod Brown, depending on who wins the primary there tomorrow on the Republican side, how does that change Brown's odds? Who could he most easily or struggle most to beat?
Well, I've heard the argument that he wants to run against a Trump-endorsed candidate, and yet I've seen Bernie Moreno, that individual, and man, he is a good campaigner. He's got this incredible give and take with voters. You may disagree with Trump's endorsement, but as a candidate, as someone who's going to be heard, the people of Ohio can connect with someone who, like them, worked hard, played by the rules, exceeded expectations in his career. He's a businessman, a very successful one. And so while you may be focusing on Trump, his endorsement, Bernie Moreno, I think, is actually the best of the three candidates, and he's the one that Sherrod Brown should be most afraid of in November.